As the plane ascended into the sky, the steady hum of the engines filled the cabin. Flight attendants moved down the aisle, attending to passengers, but Stephanie remained focused on her own thoughts, her mind racing. She had been a loyal and frequent flyer with this airline for years, enjoying the comforts and privileges of first class. But today something was different. The situation had shifted in a way that made her uneasy, as if she were being singled out for reasons that had little to do with the logistics the attendants were citing. Moments later, the flight attendant returned to Stephanie's seat. Her expression, a mix of concern and apprehension, immediately caught Stephanie's attention. It was as though the woman were bracing herself for a confrontation. "Ma'am, I've spoken with the captain and we've come up with a solution," the attendant said, her voice carrying a subtle layer of tension. "We'd like to offer you an upgrade to the private jet section of the plane. It's a smaller, more exclusive cabin, and we believe it would provide you with the level of comfort and service you're accustomed to." Stephanie sat up straighter, her expression calm but skeptical as she studied the attendant's face. "What about the other first-class passengers? Are they being offered the same upgrade?" she asked, her tone laced with the hint of suspicion. The attendant hesitated, her gaze shifting nervously before responding. "Well, no, ma'am. The private jet upgrade is only being offered to you." Stephanie's brow furrowed as she processed the attendant's words, a cold chill spreading through her chest. She leaned back in her seat, her eyes narrowing. "So let me get this straight," she began slowly, each word deliberate. "You're asking me, a first-class passenger, to voluntarily move to a different, more exclusive cabin, while the other passengers in this cabin are allowed to remain in their seats?" The attendant nodded, her posture shrinking slightly under the weight of Stephanie's steady gaze. "Yes, ma'am, we believe this is the best solution, given the circumstances." Stephanie's lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers tapping against the armrest. "I'm sorry, but I'm not going to accept your offer. I've already made it clear that I have no intention of moving from this seat, and I stand by that decision." The flight attendant's face flickered with confusion, her words faltering as she attempted to respond. But Stephanie raised a hand, silencing her. "Furthermore," Stephanie continued, her voice firm and unwavering, "I want to make it clear that I believe this request is being made because of my race and my status as a black woman." She paused, the weight of her words hanging in the air. "I've experienced this kind of treatment before. I'm not going to stand for it. If you have a legitimate, non-discriminatory reason for asking me to move, then I'm willing to listen. But if this is simply a case of singling me out because of the color of my skin, then I will take this matter up with the airline's management and the authorities." The attendant's face faltered. The apology that had been hovering in her eyes shrank as she tried to absorb Stephanie's pointed words. "Ma'am," she said, her voice small, "I can assure you that this has nothing to do with your race or your status. We're simply trying to accommodate all of our passengers to the best of our ability." Stephanie's gaze never wavered. "If this were truly about accommodating all passengers," she said, "then you would be asking the other first-class passengers to volunteer as well. Instead, you're singling me out and I won't stand for it." The attendant opened her mouth to respond, but Stephanie cut her off again. "I want to speak to the captain now." The attendant hesitated, her hands wringing together nervously. After a moment she nodded. "Of course, ma'am. I'll let the captain know that you'd like to speak with him." As the attendant hurried away, Stephanie felt a growing sense of resolve. Her thoughts were now laser-focused on the task ahead. She was determined to uncover the truth behind what she felt was an unfair, possibly discriminatory treatment. She knew that her actions, while likely to create tension, could have far-reaching consequences, not just for this airline, but for the larger airline industry as a whole. The thought of standing up for herself and others who might have faced similar treatment gave her strength. This was her moment to make sure that no one else would experience the sort of dismissive treatment she had felt, especially when it was rooted in race. The minutes passed slowly. As the plane continued its journey through the skies, Stephanie pondered how she might approach the conversation with the captain. She knew she needed to be firm but also diplomatic in order to make her point effectively, without coming across as too confrontational. Stephanie's sense of justice was well known within her professional circles, but today she would need to step into a different role, not just as a successful high-profile investor, but as an advocate for fairness, dignity, and respect. After a while, the flight attendant returned, her expression even more somber than before. There was a hint of uncertainty in her eyes as she approached Stephanie's seat. "Ma'am," the attendant began, her voice softer than before, "I understand your position, and I truly apologize for the inconvenience. However, we really do have a situation with the passenger manifest, and we need to find a solution." Stephanie met the attendant's eyes with a calm but unwavering gaze. "I've already made my position clear," she said, her voice steady. "I'm a loyal and frequent flyer with this airline. I've never been asked to downgrade my seat before, and I don't appreciate being singled out in this manner." The attendant nodded, looking at her with a mixture of understanding and discomfort. "I understand your concerns, ma'am. And I can assure you that this request has nothing to do with your race or status. It's simply a matter of logistics and ensuring that all of our passengers are accommodated." Stephanie's eyebrow arched in skepticism, but she said nothing for a long moment. Finally she spoke. "If this truly has nothing to do with my race or my status as a passenger, then why am I the one being asked to move, while the other first-class passengers remain in their seats?" The attendant paused, her gaze shifting nervously between Stephanie and the other passengers in the cabin. "Ma'am," she began, her voice tentative, "I can assure you that this is not a personal matter. We simply have a few more passengers than we anticipated, and we're trying to find the best solution for everyone." Stephanie shook her head. "I'm sorry, but I'm not convinced. If this were truly about logistics, then you would be asking all of the first-class passengers to volunteer, not just me. I've been in this situation before, and I know what it feels like to be singled out and treated differently because of the color of my skin." The attendant's shoulders slumped and she let out a deep sigh. "You're right, ma'am. I apologize for the way this situation has been handled. Let me speak to the captain again and see if we can find another solution." With that, the attendant hurried away, leaving Stephanie alone with her thoughts. As the plane taxied down the runway, Stephanie glanced out the window, watching the ground disappear beneath them. She couldn't help but wonder how many other passengers had experienced similar treatment in silence and how often these incidents went unnoticed or unaddressed. Stephanie was determined that she would not let this slide. As a leader in her industry and a significant investor in the airline, she had a responsibility to speak up and demand better. She had worked far too hard to build her career to allow her status to be dismissed in such an insensitive manner. Stephanie knew that this fight would not just be about her individual experience, it was about challenging the larger, systemic issues that still pervaded so many industries including her own. And if she could leverage her influence to start creating meaningful change, she would do so, no matter how uncomfortable it made others. Stephanie Wilson sat back in her plush seat, gazing out of the plane's window as it ascended into the bright blue sky. The familiar sound of the engines hummed steadily around her, but her mind was anything but calm. The initial sense of excitement she had felt earlier in the day had been replaced by a deepening unease. She had worked hard to build her career, to establish herself as a successful businesswoman, and to become a major investor in the very airline that now seemed to be treating her like a second-class citizen. The thought of her wealth, status, and years of loyalty being disregarded because of a sudden, inexplicable request to move to a different cabin was infuriating. And she wasn't going to let this go. Stephanie had long been accustomed to the trappings of her success: first-class seats, VIP treatment, and the privileges that came with being a regular, high-paying customer. But this was different. She had worked hard to carve out a place for herself in a world that often seemed bent on questioning her worth, especially as a successful black woman. The airline's request to move her, of all passengers, from first class to economy made her question everything. She had been in these situations before: subtle, dismissive gestures, offhand comments, and the painful undercurrent of bias that often went unnoticed by others. But this time she would not let it slide. As the plane climbed higher, Stephanie's thoughts raced. She needed to address this issue, and not just for herself, but for others who might find themselves in a similar position. She had worked too hard to build her status and reputation to be treated as though she didn't belong. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became that this incident was not just an isolated case of poor customer service, it was part of a larger pattern that needed to be addressed. She couldn't let the airline simply sweep this under the rug. No, she was determined to use her platform and influence to create meaningful change. In that moment, Stephanie made a vow to herself. She would not rest until the airline had been held accountable. She would speak to the captain, the airline's management, and if necessary the media, to ensure that what had happened to her would never happen again. She was ready to fight for fairness, for respect, and for the dignity that every passenger, regardless of their race, gender, or social status, deserved. As she stared out the window, the plane soaring through the clear blue sky, a deep breath left her chest and she settled back into her seat. The journey ahead, she knew, would not be an easy one. The airline industry was notoriously resistant to change, and she was well aware of the power dynamics at play. But Stephanie had never backed down from a challenge. She had built her career from the ground up, overcoming obstacles that many believed were insurmountable. If she could conquer those, she could conquer this too. It had all started earlier that morning. Stephanie had woken up with a sense of anticipation. She had prepared for this trip with care, and there was something about the morning air, crisp and bright, that felt like the beginning of something new. As one of the airline's most loyal and frequent flyers, Stephanie was no stranger to the sights and sounds of air travel. She had spent countless hours in airport terminals, lounges and flight cabins, always in first class, where she felt a sense of comfort and control. Today, however, she noticed a small flicker of excitement as she approached the first-class check-in counter. Stephanie was a successful businesswoman, having built a thriving career in the tech industry. Over the years, she had expanded her portfolio, becoming an investor in several high-profile companies, including this very airline. She had been instrumental in its growth, contributing significantly to its success. So, when she handed over her boarding pass at the counter, the agent's warm greeting felt like a natural acknowledgement of their shared history. "Good morning, Miss Wilson," the agent said, recognizing her instantly. "It's wonderful to see you again. Please let me know if there's anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable." Stephanie returned the smile as she always did. "Good morning. I'm looking forward to a smooth and enjoyable journey today." After a brief exchange, the agent printed out her boarding pass, and Stephanie made her way to the first-class lounge. The lounge was bustling with activity, but the atmosphere was always calm, sophisticated, and comfortable. She settled into one of the plush leather chairs, savoring the moment of quiet before the flight. Other well-dressed passengers moved about, engaged in quiet conversations, some discussing business deals, others catching up with colleagues. As she sipped on a refreshing beverage, Stephanie quickly reviewed some important documents on her tablet, preparing for the meetings that awaited her at her destination. The boarding announcement soon echoed through the lounge, signaling the end of the peaceful interlude. Stephanie gathered her things and made her way to the gate, joining the queue of first-class passengers. She enjoyed the luxury of having time to herself, savoring the moment before the plane's doors closed and the world outside receded into the distance. As she walked down the jetway and onto the plane, the flight attendant at the entrance greeted her with a polite, professional smile. "Good morning, Miss Wilson," the attendant said, ushering her toward her seat. "We're delighted to have you on board." Stephanie smiled in return, grateful for the warm welcome. She carefully stowed her carry-on luggage in the overhead compartment and settled into her spacious seat. The first-class cabin was almost empty, just a few passengers scattered throughout the luxurious space. It felt like her personal haven, a sanctuary for relaxation. She was just about to settle into the in-flight entertainment system when another flight attendant approached her. "Good morning, ma'am," the attendant said, her voice soft and professional. "I'm afraid there's been a slight issue with the passenger manifest. We have a few more first-class passengers than we anticipated. Would you be willing to move to an economy seat for this flight?" Stephanie's brow furrowed as she processed the request. The surprise and confusion were evident on her face. She had booked a first-class ticket with the expectation of a certain level of service and comfort. The idea of being asked to downgrade to economy was not just unexpected. It felt degrading. "I'm sorry, I don't understand," she said, her tone reserved but firm. "I booked a first-class ticket, and I was looking forward to enjoying the amenities of this cabin. Is there a problem with my reservation?" The attendant hesitated, sensing the subtle tension in Stephanie's voice. "No, ma'am, there's no issue with your reservation," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "We simply have more passengers than we anticipated, and we're asking some of our first-class customers to voluntarily move to the economy section for this flight." Stephanie studied the attendant carefully, her suspicion growing. Why, out of all the passengers in first class, was she the one being singled out? Could this request be rooted in something deeper, something less obvious? Was her race and social status at play here? Throughout her life, Stephanie had encountered her fair share of subtle discrimination, comments, glances, and assumptions made because of the color of her skin. But this felt like something more. "I'm afraid I can't accommodate your request," Stephanie said, her voice unwavering. "I'm a loyal and frequent flyer with this airline. I've come to expect a certain level of service when traveling in the first-class cabin, and I have no intention of moving to economy." The flight attendant's eyes widened, clearly taken aback by Stephanie's firm response. "I understand, ma'am," she said, her voice softening. "Let me see if we can find another solution." With that, the attendant hurried away, leaving Stephanie to ponder what had just happened. She watched as the attendant spoke to her colleagues, but the knot in her stomach tightened. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a bigger problem, one that Stephanie had encountered before but never let slide. She knew this was the moment to take a stand, to demand respect not only for herself but for others who might face the same kind of treatment. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Stephanie settled back into her seat, mentally preparing for the conversation with the captain. She was making a bold move and she knew there would be consequences. The airline industry was notoriously resistant to change, but she was ready to fight for fairness and dignity. She was determined to make her voice heard, not just for herself, but for the many passengers who had been treated as though they didn't belong, simply because of who they were. Soon, the captain, a seasoned and well-respected pilot, approached Stephanie's seat. He greeted her with a warm smile, his voice calm and measured. "Good morning, Miss Wilson. I understand there's been a bit of a situation. The flight attendant informed me that you were asked to move to a different seat, and you declined. I'd like to understand your perspective and see if we can find a resolution." Stephanie nodded, her gaze steady and unwavering. "Good morning, Captain. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me about this. As I've made clear to the flight attendant, I have no intention of moving from my first-class seat. I paid for this ticket, and I expect to be treated with the same respect as every other passenger in this cabin." Stephanie Wilson sat in her first-class seat, her body positioned comfortably against the plush fabric of the chair, yet her mind was far from relaxed. The sound of the plane's engines humming as they gained altitude barely registered in her awareness, drowned out by the chaos of her thoughts. She had been looking forward to this flight, a routine journey for her, as familiar as the countless others she had taken over the years. But today something had happened that made the whole experience feel wrong. It wasn't just the inconvenience of the request she had received to move to economy class, it was the unsettling feeling that had taken root in her chest. The feeling that this had less to do with the flight's logistics and more to do with the assumptions others had made about her based on her race. As the plane continued to climb, her mind replayed the events that had unfolded earlier. Stephanie was a loyal and frequent flyer, someone who had invested heavily in the airline, not just as a customer but as a key partner. She had built an incredibly successful career in the tech industry, and over the years her investments had contributed to the airline's growth and prosperity. But despite this long history and her status as one of the airline's most valued investors, she had been singled out, asked to move from her first-class seat to an economy seat, as if her investment, her loyalty, and her worth to the company counted for nothing. It felt like a slap in the face. The request had come as a surprise, and not the kind of surprise that accompanied an unexpected gift or a happy event. No, this was the kind of surprise that stung, the kind that made you question the motives of those involved. The flight attendant had approached her with a polite but somewhat rehearsed smile, informing her that there had been an issue with the passenger manifest and that they had more first-class passengers than anticipated. She had been asked, as a volunteer, to move to the economy section for the flight. Stephanie's immediate response had been one of disbelief. After all, she had booked her first-class ticket months in advance. She had come to expect a certain level of service from the airline, service that matched the price she paid and the loyalty she had demonstrated over the years. When she had questioned the flight attendant, she was assured that this was not a mistake with her reservation but a voluntary request, part of an effort to accommodate more passengers. The airline was facing an overbooked flight, and they were asking a few first-class customers to give up their seats to help balance things out. The more Stephanie thought about it, the more it felt like a move designed to make her, of all people, accommodate for the airline's lack of planning when, as a significant investor, she should have been treated with the utmost respect. Her first-class seat was the very least she deserved, considering her investment and influence in the airline's success. As the attendant had left to consult with her colleagues, Stephanie's thoughts turned more grim. She had encountered discrimination throughout her life, both subtle and overt, but never in this way, not from a company she had helped build. This wasn't just about a seat on a plane, this was about respect. If the airline was asking her to move, why wasn't anyone else being asked to do the same? Why had she been singled out? It was a question that haunted her, the idea that her race might be a factor, an uncomfortable possibility that, unfortunately, she knew too well. Being a black woman who had risen to the heights of corporate success, she had always faced the challenge of being underestimated, of having her achievements questioned simply because of who she was. But this felt personal. She was determined not to let it slide. As the plane's ascent continued, Stephanie made up her mind. She would get to the bottom of this. She wasn't just going to let this incident fade into the background. She wasn't going to let her experience become just another example of how the world turned a blind eye to racial biases and discrimination. If she had to fight for her seat on the plane, she would fight for something more. She would fight for fairness, for accountability, and for the kind of change that would ensure no one else would ever have to endure the indignity she had faced today. She wasn't just a passenger, she was an investor, an integral part of the company's success. She had earned her place in that first-class cabin, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it away from her. The attendant hesitated, sensing the subtle tension in Stephanie's voice. "No, ma'am, there's no issue with your reservation," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "We simply have more passengers than we anticipated, and we're asking some of our first-class customers to voluntarily move to the economy section for this flight." Stephanie studied the attendant carefully, her suspicion growing. Why, out of all the passengers in first class, was she the one being singled out? Could this request be rooted in something deeper, something less obvious? Was her race and social status at play here? Throughout her life, Stephanie had encountered her fair share of subtle discrimination, comments, glances, and assumptions made because of the color of her skin. But this felt like something more. "I'm afraid I can't accommodate your request," Stephanie said, her voice unwavering. "I'm a loyal and frequent flyer with this airline. I've come to expect a certain level of service when traveling in the first-class cabin, and I have no intention of moving to economy." The flight attendant's eyes widened, clearly taken aback by Stephanie's firm response. "I understand, ma'am," she said, her voice softening. "Let me see if we can find another solution." With that, the attendant hurried away, leaving Stephanie to ponder what had just happened. She watched as the attendant spoke to her colleagues, but the knot in her stomach tightened. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a bigger problem, one that Stephanie had encountered before but never let slide. She knew this was the moment to take a stand, to demand respect not only for herself but for others who might face the same kind of treatment. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Stephanie settled back into her seat, mentally preparing for the conversation with the captain. She was making a bold move, and she knew there would be consequences. The airline industry was notoriously resistant to change, but she was ready to fight for fairness and dignity. She was determined to make her voice heard, not just for herself, but for the many passengers who had been treated as though they didn't belong, simply because of who they were. Soon, the captain, a seasoned and well-respected pilot, approached Stephanie's seat. He greeted her with a warm smile, his voice calm and measured. "Good morning, Miss Wilson. I understand there's been a bit of a situation. The flight attendant informed me that you were asked to move to a different seat, and you declined. I'd like to understand your perspective and see if we can find a resolution." Stephanie nodded, her gaze steady and unwavering. "Good morning, Captain. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me about this. As I've made clear to the flight attendant, I have no intention of moving from my first-class seat. I paid for this ticket, and I expect to be treated with the same respect as every other passenger in this cabin." Stephanie Wilson sat in her first-class seat, her body positioned comfortably against the plush fabric of the chair, yet her mind was far from relaxed. The sound of the plane's engines humming as they gained altitude barely registered in her awareness, drowned out by the chaos of her thoughts. She had been looking forward to this flight, a routine journey for her, as familiar as the countless others she had taken over the years. But today something had happened that made the whole experience feel wrong. It wasn't just the inconvenience of the request she had received to move to economy class, it was the unsettling feeling that had taken root in her chest. The feeling that this had less to do with the flight's logistics and more to do with the assumptions others had made about her based on her race. As the plane continued to climb, her mind replayed the events that had unfolded earlier. Stephanie was a loyal and frequent flyer, someone who had invested heavily in the airline, not just as a customer but as a key partner. She had built an incredibly successful career in the tech industry, and over the years her investments had contributed to the airline's growth and prosperity. But despite this long history and her status as one of the airline's most valued investors, she had been singled out, asked to move from her first-class seat to an economy seat, as if her investment, her loyalty, and her worth to the company counted for nothing. It felt like a slap in the face. The request had come as a surprise, and not the kind of surprise that accompanied an unexpected gift or a happy event. No, this was the kind of surprise that stung, the kind that made you question the motives of those involved. The flight attendant had approached her with a polite but somewhat rehearsed smile, informing her that there had been an issue with the passenger manifest and that they had more first-class passengers than anticipated. She had been asked, as a volunteer, to move to the economy section for the flight. Stephanie's immediate response had been one of disbelief. After all, she had booked her first-class ticket months in advance. She had come to expect a certain level of service from the airline, service that matched the price she paid and the loyalty she had demonstrated over the years. When she had questioned the flight attendant, she was assured that this was not a mistake with her reservation but a voluntary request, part of an effort to accommodate more passengers. The airline was facing an overbooked flight, and they were asking a few first-class customers to give up their seats to help balance things out. The more Stephanie thought about it, the more it felt like a move designed to make her, of all people, accommodate for the airline's lack of planning when, as a significant investor, she should have been treated with the utmost respect. Her first-class seat was the very least she deserved, considering her investment and influence in the airline's success. As the attendant had left to consult with her colleagues, Stephanie's thoughts turned more grim. She had encountered discrimination throughout her life, both subtle and overt, but never in this way, not from a company she had helped build. This wasn't just about a seat on a plane, this was about respect. If the airline was asking her to move, why wasn't anyone else being asked to do the same? Why had she been singled out? It was a question that haunted her, the idea that her race might be a factor, an uncomfortable possibility that, unfortunately, she knew too well. Being a black woman who had risen to the heights of corporate success, she had always faced the challenge of being underestimated, of having her achievements questioned simply because of who she was. But this felt personal. She was determined not to let it slide. As the plane's ascent continued, Stephanie made up her mind. She would get to the bottom of this. She wasn't just going to let this incident fade into the background. She wasn't going to let her experience become just another example of how the world turned a blind eye to racial biases and discrimination. If she had to fight for her seat on the plane, she would fight for something more. She would fight for fairness, for accountability, and for the kind of change that would ensure no one else would ever have to endure the indignity she had faced today. She wasn't just a passenger, she was an investor, an integral part of the company's success. She had earned her place in that first-class cabin, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it away from her. When she walked into the lounge, she was greeted by a small team of airline representatives who ushered her into the room where the executives were already waiting. There was a noticeable heaviness in the air. The group of executives, some of whom she recognized, were clearly not at ease. Their faces reflected concern, perhaps even guilt, as if they understood that the severity of the situation had finally reached a boiling point. The CEO of the airline, a seasoned industry veteran named Mr. Callahan, approached her first. His typically confident demeanor seemed softened by a hint of trepidation, the kind of uncertainty that one feels when faced with a crisis of their own making. "Miss Wilson, thank you for taking the time to meet with us," he began, his voice steady but tinged with sincerity. "I want to personally apologize on behalf of the entire airline for the incident that occurred on your flight. It's clear that we have failed to uphold the standards of service and respect that we strive for, and we are committed to addressing this issue head-on." Stephanie listened intently, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't here for empty apologies or vague assurances. She had seen too many instances where companies promised change but did little to follow through. She needed to hear that they were truly committed to making lasting adjustments, that the incident she had experienced wasn't just an isolated event but part of a broader, systemic issue that needed to be corrected. She stood tall and responded with the calm authority that had defined her throughout her career, her voice measured yet firm. "Thank you, Mr. Callahan. I appreciate your willingness to meet with me and discuss this matter. As you can imagine, I am deeply troubled by what happened, and I'm determined to ensure that it doesn't happen again, not just to me but to any passenger who comes through your doors." Mr. Callahan nodded solemnly, his expression serious. "You're absolutely right, Miss Wilson. This incident has highlighted a deeper issue within our organization, and we are committed to taking immediate action to address it. This goes beyond one isolated incident. It speaks to a larger cultural issue that we need to tackle." Stephanie held his gaze, her mind racing through the many possible outcomes of this meeting. This was her moment. She had the opportunity to push for real change, not just for herself but for all passengers who had ever felt overlooked or mistreated by the airline industry. She could feel the weight of responsibility on her shoulders, but she was determined not to falter. "I appreciate your understanding of the situation," she said, her voice resolute. "But understanding the problem is just the beginning. Now we need to act. The airline needs to make meaningful changes in the way it operates, and that starts with addressing the unconscious biases that exist within your organization." The room grew quiet as the executives exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement. Stephanie knew that this was a crucial point, the point where they would either commit to real action or let the conversation drift into empty promises. She was ready to hold them accountable. "Unconscious bias is pervasive," she continued. "It can manifest in subtle and insidious ways, often without the person even realizing it. It's not enough to simply tell your employees to treat all passengers with respect. You need to give them the tools to recognize their own biases and teach them how to overcome them. This isn't a one-time training session. It's an ongoing process, a long-term investment in creating a more inclusive and equitable organization. The senior executives sat up straighter, their attention now fully focused on Stephanie as she laid out her vision for change. One of the board members, a senior vice president, spoke up, his tone thoughtful. "I agree with you, Miss Wilson. We've been too reactive in the past, and this is a wake-up call for us. We can't just patch things up with a quick fix. We need to look at this issue comprehensively and systematically." Stephanie nodded, encouraged by the response. "Exactly. It's about creating a culture of accountability. If we're serious about making changes, we need to ensure that this kind of treatment doesn't happen again. That means implementing comprehensive unconscious bias training for all employees, from frontline staff to executives. It means creating a feedback system that empowers passengers to report incidents of bias and discrimination. And it means taking swift action when those incidents occur." The executives listened intently, acknowledging the importance of these steps. As the conversation unfolded, Stephanie could sense a shift in the room. This wasn't just a meeting where the airline's leadership was trying to placate her. It was a moment where they were beginning to understand the scale of the problem and the changes that needed to be made. It was clear that they recognized the stakes. The airline's reputation, their relationship with customers, and ultimately their long-term success depended on addressing these issues head-on. By the end of the meeting, a plan had started to take shape. The airline had committed to a comprehensive unconscious bias training program, one that would be rolled out across the entire organization. It would cover everything from customer service to decision-making at the executive level. Additionally, Stephanie had been invited to join the newly formed Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Board, which would give her a direct line of communication with the leadership team and allow her to help shape the policies that would guide the airline's future interactions with its customers. It was a significant step forward, but Stephanie knew that the work was far from over. This was just the beginning. Over the following months, she worked tirelessly with the advisory board, pushing for measurable changes. One of her first priorities was overseeing the implementation of the unconscious bias training program. She knew that it would take time for the lessons to sink in and for real change to be felt, but she was committed to ensuring that the airline's employees had the tools they needed to recognize and address their own biases. In parallel, Stephanie championed the creation of a customer feedback system that prioritized incidents of racial bias and discrimination. "We need to create an environment where our customers feel heard and respected," she told the executives during a board meeting. "By making it easier for passengers to report incidents of bias, we can identify patterns and take swift action to address them." The feedback system was implemented within a few months, and Stephanie closely monitored its progress. She was pleased to see that passengers were beginning to report incidents more frequently, and the airline was responding in a timely manner, addressing complaints and making adjustments as needed. It was a small but important victory. As the months passed, Stephanie's efforts began to yield tangible results. The airline's commitment to diversity and inclusion grew stronger, and her influence within the company became undeniable. Her work had set a new standard for what could be achieved when someone in a position of power decided to challenge the status quo and demand accountability. Stephanie's story had become an inspiration to many. She was hailed as a trailblazer, a force to be reckoned with in the industry. Her actions had shown that one person, armed with a sense of purpose and the willingness to push for change, could make a real and lasting difference. As she sat in the lounge, reflecting on the journey she had undertaken, Stephanie felt a profound sense of pride. The road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, but she was ready. She had proven that her influence could make a difference, and she was determined to continue using her platform to drive positive change within the airline industry and beyond. Stephanie Wilson sat at the large conference table in the private VIP lounge, her mind racing with thoughts of the potential implications of the meeting ahead. The airline's leadership had made it clear that they were serious about addressing the incident she had experienced, but Stephanie knew that the stakes were higher than just her own personal experience. This wasn't simply about her, it was about the countless other passengers, particularly those from marginalized communities, who had likely faced similar discriminatory treatment at the hands of airline employees. Stephanie's resolve was unwavering as she prepared to speak to the CEO, the Chief Diversity Officer (CDO), and other top executives. She was determined to push for real, meaningful change, not just for herself but for all those who had suffered in silence. Taking a deep breath, she steeled herself for what she was about to say. "Mr. Callahan," she began, her voice calm but firm, "I want to make it clear that this is not just about me. This is about the countless other passengers, especially those from marginalized communities, who have likely experienced similar treatment at the hands of your employees? She paused for a moment, locking eyes with the CEO to ensure that he understood the gravity of her words. I'm not here to demand special treatment or compensation, she continued. I'm here to ensure that real, meaningful change is enacted. This has gone on far too long and it needs to stop now. The room was silent for a few moments, the weight of her statement sinking in. Mr. Callahan, the CEO, nodded slowly, his expression shifting to one of determination. You have my word, Miss Wilson, he said, his voice now resolute. We will be taking immediate steps to address this issue, starting with a comprehensive review of our customer service training and protocols. We will also be implementing new oversight mechanisms to ensure that incidents like this are swiftly identified and addressed. His words seemed sincere, and Stephanie felt a sense of relief wash over her. It was a positive start, but she knew that the real work was just beginning. I'm glad to hear that, Mr. Callahan, Stephanie said, her tone still composed but underscored by a firmness that matched her resolve. However, I want to make it clear that I will be closely monitoring the progress of these changes. I expect to see tangible results within the next 6 months. We need to see concrete evidence that these steps are having a real impact. It's not enough to talk about change, we need to see it in action. The CDO nodded, his expression resolute. Understood, Miss Wilson. We will be providing you with regular updates on our progress, and we welcome your input and guidance as we work to create a more inclusive and equitable environment for all of our passengers. As the meeting came to a close, Stephanie couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. She had been clear, firm, and unwavering in her commitment to driving real change. This wasn't just a personal matter for her, it was about changing the way the airline and the industry at large approached issues of bias and discrimination. While the airline had taken the first step toward acknowledging the problem, Stephanie knew that the real challenge lay in ensuring that the policies and changes they promised would be fully implemented and sustained. When she left the VIP lounge and made her way through the terminal, her mind was filled with thoughts of the work ahead. The meeting had been productive, but the journey was far from over. As the airline began to implement and refine its diversity and inclusion initiatives, Stephanie's story began to resonate more deeply within the industry and beyond. Her courage in speaking out had inspired others to come forward, sharing their own experiences of discrimination and bias within the airline industry. Influential Black passengers and industry leaders, many of whom had kept their experiences to themselves for years, began to speak up, adding their voices to the growing chorus for change. One by one, their stories began to surface. Amara, a well-known travel influencer, spoke openly about her own encounters with airline staff who had singled her out and asked her to make accommodations that no one else was asked to make. When I heard about what happened to Stephanie, it was like reliving my own experience all over again, Amara said. I've been in that same position. It's demoralizing and unacceptable. Her words, along with those of countless others, highlighted the broader problem and helped to galvanize support for the changes that Stephanie and the Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Board were advocating for. Derek, a frequent flyer and respected business leader, also spoke out, underscoring the collective frustration that many had felt for years. Stephanie's not just fighting for herself, he said. She's fighting for all of us who've had to endure this kind of treatment. That's why her story resonates so deeply with so many of us. It's not just about her, it's about all of us. As the public's attention turned to the airline's diversity and inclusion efforts, the company found itself under increasing scrutiny. Customers, investors, and industry watchdogs alike began to demand greater transparency and accountability. They wanted to see not just surface-level reforms, but genuine, deep-rooted changes that would address the systemic issues that had been allowed to fester within the industry for so long. Stephanie recognized that this growing public pressure was a pivotal moment. It was a test of the airline's commitment to real and lasting change. This is our opportunity to show the world that we're serious about creating a more inclusive and equitable environment, Stephanie said during a meeting with the Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Board. We can't afford to backslide or make half measures. We need to go all in, and we need to do it in a way that sets a new standard for the industry. We have a chance to lead by example. With Stephanie's guidance, the airline made a bold commitment to expand the scope and scale of its diversity and inclusion initiatives. The company didn't just increase its investment in employee training and customer engagement programs, it also began to actively seek out diverse suppliers and partners. The airline took steps to promote the leadership of underrepresented groups within the organization, ensuring that the company's senior ranks reflected the diversity of the communities it served. The results of these efforts were swift and tangible. Within a matter of months, the airline's customer satisfaction scores began to improve as passengers from all backgrounds reported feeling more respected and valued. The company's workforce also began to reflect a broader diversity, with a clear pipeline of talent emerging that was more inclusive and representative of the population at large. Stephanie's continued leadership in guiding the airline through this transformative process had not gone unnoticed. She began to emerge as a respected voice within the industry, sharing her insights and experiences with other companies and organizations that were grappling with similar challenges. Her story had become a testament to the power of perseverance and an example of how one person, armed with a strong sense of purpose and an unwavering commitment to change, could make a real and lasting difference. In the months that followed the initial confrontation with the airline, the company's efforts to address racial bias and discrimination began to take shape under Stephanie's leadership. One of the first major initiatives was the rollout of a mandatory unconscious bias training program. Every employee, from frontline staff to the executive team, was required to participate in intensive training sessions designed to help them recognize and overcome their own biases. Stephanie was firm in her belief that this training was essential. "It's not enough to simply tell our employees to be respectful and inclusive," she explained during one of the board's meetings. "We need to give them the tools and the understanding to truly internalize these values and put them into practice every single day. This isn't about checking a box. This is about creating a culture of inclusivity." While the training program was met with some initial resistance, especially from employees who felt singled out or uncomfortable with the process, Stephanie and the advisory board remained steadfast in their commitment. They emphasized the long-term benefits that the training would bring to both the company and its customers. Over time, the program gained momentum, and employees began to see the value in it, not just for the company but for themselves as individuals who would benefit from becoming more self-aware and empathetic in their interactions with others. At the same time, the airline implemented a new customer feedback system that prioritized addressing incidents of bias and discrimination. Passengers were now empowered to report their experiences more easily, and the company committed to taking swift action when incidents occurred. This system gave customers a greater sense of confidence that their concerns would be heard and addressed appropriately. Stephanie's tireless advocacy for these changes and her commitment to pushing the airline forward helped to create a new culture within the company, one that was more inclusive, more transparent, and more responsive to the needs of all passengers, regardless of their background. The impact of her efforts went far beyond the walls of the airline, as other companies took notice of the changes taking place and began to follow suit. Through it all, Stephanie remained steadfast in her belief that meaningful change was possible, that one person, armed with determination and a clear vision, could make a lasting difference. As her influence continued to grow, Stephanie's story became a beacon of hope for those who had long felt marginalized, and her commitment to driving real change in the airline industry set a new standard for how companies should approach issues of racial bias, discrimination, and inclusivity. As the airline's efforts to address racial bias and discrimination continued to evolve, passengers were given an unprecedented opportunity to voice their concerns through the newly implemented customer feedback system. This system became a cornerstone of the airline's commitment to ensuring that every passenger, regardless of their background or identity, felt heard, respected, and valued. The leadership team, under the guidance of Stephanie Wilson, was resolute in its dedication to investigating each case of discrimination swiftly and decisively. "We want our customers to feel heard and respected, no matter who they are or where they come from," Stephanie stated in a public message. "By making it easier for them to share their experiences, we can identify patterns and take the necessary steps to address them. This isn't just about fixing problems, it's about creating an environment where people feel safe, respected, and valued." The impact of the new feedback system was immediate. Hundreds of passengers, many of whom had been reluctant to come forward in the past, began sharing their stories. The feedback ranged from complaints about unfair treatment to accounts of subtle, everyday bias. For many, it was a cathartic experience, as they were finally able to speak openly about the discrimination they had faced. In the weeks that followed, passengers expressed a sense of relief and gratitude for the airline's willingness to listen. Several individuals even praised Stephanie personally, acknowledging her role in driving the company's commitment to change. The success of the feedback system was only one aspect of the broader transformation taking place within the airline. Alongside operational reforms, the Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Board, which Stephanie had played a pivotal role in establishing, worked tirelessly to create a more inclusive culture within the company. This included the implementation of employee resource groups, mentorship programs and targeted recruitment efforts to attract a more diverse workforce. The goal was not simply to address bias in customer service, but to ensure that the company's internal culture was reflective of the values it aimed to promote externally. Diversity and inclusion aren't just buzzwords, Stephanie explained during one of the board's meetings. They are essential components of a healthy, thriving organization. By investing in our people and creating an environment where everyone feels valued and respected, we can not only improve our customer experience but also drive innovation and growth. The more inclusive we are, the stronger we become. Stephanie's efforts did not go unnoticed. Her story and the company's transformation soon became a source of inspiration for others within the industry, as well as for the broader public. Industry leaders hailed her as a trailblazer, a champion of change, and a shining example of what could be achieved when someone with influence and determination steps up to challenge the status quo. Media outlets began to feature her as an advocate for social justice and equality, further solidifying her role as a leader in the fight against discrimination. As the months turned into years, the airline continued to refine and expand its diversity and inclusion initiatives, with Stephanie playing a crucial role in guiding the company's progress. She remained a steadfast advocate for change, consistently pushing the leadership team to go further, reach higher, and do more to create a truly equitable and inclusive environment for all. "This isn't just about one incident or one company," Stephanie said in an interview. "It's about transforming an entire industry and sending a clear message that discrimination and bias will not be tolerated. We have a long way to go, but I'm more determined than ever to lead the way. This is about setting a new standard for what the airline industry should be, and we're just getting started." As the years passed, the airline's transformation under Stephanie's guidance continued to gain momentum. The company's diversity and inclusion efforts became a shining example of what could be achieved when an organization was willing to confront its own biases and shortcomings head-on. The mandatory unconscious bias training program that Stephanie had championed was expanded to include all new hires, ensuring that every member of the team, from frontline staff to executive leadership, received the training necessary to create a more inclusive environment. The customer feedback system also became an invaluable tool for the airline, allowing the company to identify and address issues of discrimination in real time. The system enabled passengers to report instances of bias, whether intentional or unintentional, and the company was committed to investigating each case thoroughly. Through this transparent approach, the airline was able to address individual issues while also identifying broader patterns that could be rectified. Moreover, the airline made significant strides in diversifying its workforce. Over time, the company's leadership team began to better reflect the rich diversity of the communities it served. This shift in leadership had a ripple effect throughout the entire organization, fostering a more inclusive and collaborative culture. Employees were now more likely to see individuals who looked like them in positions of authority, which contributed to a greater sense of belonging and empowerment within the company. "The changes we've seen over the past few years have been nothing short of transformative," said Derek, a frequent flyer and business leader who had shared his own story of discrimination. "Stephanie's willingness to stand up and fight for change has inspired all of us, and it's clear that the airline is reaping the benefits of her efforts. This is an example of what happens when someone with conviction takes the lead. It's not just about fixing problems, it's about building something better, something that lasts." Indeed, the airline's reputation underwent a striking transformation. Once seen as a bastion of exclusivity and privilege, it had now become a symbol of inclusivity and progress. The airline attracted a new generation of customers who valued diversity and equity as much as they did the quality of the service. Travelers from all walks of life, particularly those from marginalized communities, felt that they were not only being heard but also respected and understood. For these customers, the airline was no longer just a service provider, it was an organization that shared their values and upheld principles of fairness. Stephanie's story had become a touchstone for the industry. "It's a reminder that real change is possible," said Amara, a prominent travel influencer who had also spoken out about her experiences of discrimination within the industry. "When someone with influence and determination steps up to challenge the status quo, they can make a real and lasting difference. Stephanie is proof of that." As Stephanie's role within the airline and the broader industry continued to grow, she found herself in increasingly high demand as a speaker and thought leader. Invitations to industry conferences and events came frequently, and Stephanie often shared the stage with other trailblazers who were working to create a more inclusive and equitable future across various sectors. In her speeches, she consistently emphasized the importance of perseverance and the need for systemic change. The work we've done here is just the beginning, Stephanie would tell her audiences. There's still so much more to be done, not just in the airline industry but across every sector of our economy. We need to challenge our biases and build more inclusive, equitable environments everywhere. But I'm more determined than ever to keep pushing forward, to keep challenging the status quo, and to keep creating a world where everyone, regardless of their race, gender, or background, can thrive and succeed. Her unwavering commitment to social justice had not gone unnoticed. Within the airline, Stephanie had become a role model and an inspiration to countless individuals who saw in her a reflection of their own hopes and aspirations. Colleagues admired her leadership and admired her ability to balance bold action with empathy. Her influence extended far beyond the company's walls, as her story inspired a generation of advocates, activists, and business leaders who were committed to creating a better, more inclusive world. As the airline continued to benefit from the changes Stephanie had spearheaded, it became clear that her impact would extend far beyond the walls of the company. The legacy of her work would be one of courage, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Stephanie has shown us all that when we stand up for what's right, when we refuse to back down in the face of adversity, we can create a better, more equitable world for everyone, said Derek, reflecting on her profound influence. Looking out over the horizon, Stephanie knew that her work was far from over. But with a heart full of determination and a spirit that refused to be broken, she was more than ready to continue the fight. One step at a time, she would work toward a day when true equality and inclusion were the norm, not the exception. And as she did, she would inspire countless others to join her in the pursuit of a fairer, more just world.